what happened? One went back to their families, and one stayed with Naomi. So Orpah went back. Ruth did not go back, saying to Naomi, I think a very stirring commitment. And we see that in Ruth chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. If you want to turn to that, we'll just refresh our memory. Ruth chapter 1, verses 16. And Ruth said, entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go. Where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God, my God. Verse 17, where thou diest, will I die, and there will I be buried. And the Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me. So that was quite a commitment that she made to Naomi. In Ruth chapter 1, verse 22, then it says, so Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, which returned out of the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of the barley harvest. And in chapter 2 then, verse 1, we're just reviewing this to come up to our lesson today. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, and they returned out of the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of the barley harvest. God's plan has everything worked out according to his will, doesn't he? And in Ruth chapter 2, verse 1, it says, Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a mighty man of wealth of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. So then Ruth just happened to go into Boaz's field to gain the grain to support her and Naomi, so they had something to eat anyway. And Boaz learned then about Ruth and befriended her far beyond what was customary because of what Ruth had done and her character and her quality. And then throughout that chapter, Ruth kept Naomi informed of what Boaz was doing for her. And then the last verse in chapter 2 said in chapter 2, verse 23, so she kept fast by the maidens of Boaz to glean unto the end of the barley harvest and to the end of the wheat season for harvest, and dwelt there with her mother-in-law. So that was a period of approximately 4 to 6 weeks. So now we continue the story of what happened next, going to Ruth chapter 3 and verse 1. It says, then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said unto her, my daughter, shall not I seek rest for thee, that it might be well with thee? What was she saying? Seek rest, meaning she would provide her a husband to provide for her and protect her, that she might live in peace. And then verse 2, it says, and now is not Boaz thy kindred, our kindred, that those maidens thou wast? Behold, he winnoweth the barley tonight in the threshing floor. So as said here, that winnowing that was done at night, and there was a reason for that. They would thresh out the grain during the day and then winnowed in the evening because of the breeze coming off of the lake. Now, what was Naomi's plan? She was using God's proposed way of carrying on the family name and to retain the family property Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 25, I'm sorry. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 and 6. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 5 says, "If brethren dwell together, and one of them die, and have no child, the wife of the dead shall not marry without unto a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in unto her, and take her to him to wife, and to perform the duty of the husband's brother unto her." Now here, brother means more than just we think of brother. It's the relation that's far beyond, or could be far beyond, a brother as we think of a brother, if you had a brother. And verse 6, "And it shall be that the firstborn which she beareth shall succeed in the name of his brother which is dead, and his name shall not be put out to Israel." So the concept of marrying a brother's widow, even if the person was already married, in our eyes seems wrong, right? But that was God's way of doing it. And what was the reason? The next thing was that the first son that was born does not belong to the father, but the child would carry the name of the deceased father and also inherit the deceased father's possessions. So the wife of the deceased of the land would be what the kinsman redeemer would purchase. The land would not belong, in this case, to Boaz. He would purchase the land, but it would not belong to him. And that's God's way of doing what he did to ensure that the property stayed with the family. In verse 3 of chapter 3, it says, "Wash thyself, therefore," this is what Naomi told Ruth, "and anoint thee, and put on thy raiment upon thee, and get thee down to the floor. Make not thyself known unto the man, until he shall have done eating and drinking." So what was happening here? Naomi was having Ruth make preparation for marriage. This is how they went about it at that time. So he was asking, by meaning of Ruth's laying at Boaz's feet was symbolic of her for asking him to exercise the duty and the right of kinsman redeemer, which would result in marriage, and also to purchase and redeem the land that had belonged to Amalek and eventually Mahon, which was Ruth's deceased husband, the oldest son. So in redeeming the land, in this case, Boaz would not own it. It would stay in the family of the deceased. So, the meaning of Ruth laying at Boaz's feet was symbolic of her asking him to exercise the duty and right of kinsman redeemer to marry her and to purchase the land. Again, it's not our way of doing things, but it's God's way of doing things. Let's read verses 5 through 8. Ruth chapter 3, verse 5, "And she said unto her, All that thou sayest unto me, I will do." Ruth said to Naomi. In verse 6, "And she went down to the floor and did according to all that her mother-in-law bade her. And then verse 7, and when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry. Now merry in this case means that he was satisfied, he was happy. Merry in some instances mean he was drunk. That was not the case with Boaz, if I understand this right. And he went to lie down at the end of the heap of corn, and she came softly and uncovered his feet and laid her down. And it came to pass at midnight that the man was afraid and turned himself, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. It was more like startled. If you wake up real suddenly, you're sort of startled at what was going on. And then in verse 9, and he said, who art thou? And she answered, I am Ruth, thy handmaid. Spread therefore thy skirt over thy handmaid, for thou art a near kinsman. So what had happened here? Ruth now tells Boaz that she is who she is and why she's there. She's submitting to him to marry her. So what Ruth did was the custom at that time. Verse 10. And he said, blessed be thou of the Lord, my daughter, for thou hast showed more kindness in the latter end than at the beginning, inasmuch as thou followest not young men, whether poor or rich. So rather than marrying someone else, she preferred the building up of her deceased husband's estate or land, carrying on his name and caring for Ruth. And this not only for Ruth, but for Naomi. Then verse 11, and now my daughter, fear not, I will do to thee all that thou requirest. For all the city of my people doth know that thou art a virtuous woman. So Boaz knew what was going on. He says, I'll do it. And then verse 12. We had a clinker in here. And now it is true that I am thy near kinsman. Howbeit, there is a kinsman nearer than I. So again, we have Boaz wanting to do what was right according to the law, informs Ruth that there's someone who's closer kin than he is. And he needed to take care of that situation. So now we go to chapter 4. And let's look at verses 1 through 9. If you turn to chapter 4 of Ruth, look at verses 1 through 9 that tells what's going to take place as Boaz brings up the situation of kinsman redeemer concerning the land which was Elimelech's. Okay, starting with verse 1. Chapter 4, and then Boaz went down to the gate and sat down there. Behold, the kinsman of whom Boaz spake came by, unto whom he said, Ho! Such a one turn aside, sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, Sit down here. And they sat down. And he said unto the kinsman, Naomi, which is come out of the country of Moab, selleth a parcel of land, which was our brother Elimelech's. And I thought to advertise thee, saying, Buy it before the inhabitants and before the elders of my people. If thou wilt redeem it, redeem it. But if thou wilt not redeem it, then tell me, that I may know, for there is none to redeem it besides thee, and I am after thee. And he said, I will redeem it. Then said Boaz, what day thou buyest the field of the hand of Naomi, thou must also buy it also Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance. And the kinsman said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I mar my own inheritance. Redeem thou my right to thyself, for I cannot redeem it. So not only he thought, oh yeah, I'll redeem the land, but then Boaz brings up the fact you got to take another wife, and he says, no, I'm not going to do that, because he would be added responsibility to him. And then verse 7, it says, now this was the manner in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and concerning changing for to confirm all things. A man plucked off his shoe and gave it to his neighbor, and this was a testimony in Israel. Therefore the kinsman said unto Boaz, buy it for thee. So he drew off his shoe. And Boaz said unto the elders, unto all the people, ye are witness this day that I have bought all that was Elimelech's, and all that was Chilion's and Mahon's of the hand of Naomi. So this was done according to the law. Let's turn to Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 7 to 10. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 7 through 10. So again, they were doing as God had asked them to do in the scripture. Verse 7 of chapter 25, and if a man like not to take his brother's wife, then let his brother's wife go up to the gate unto the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to raise up unto his brother a name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of my husband's brother. Then the elders of the city shall call him and speak unto him, and if he stand to it and say, I like not to take her, then shall his brother's wife come unto him in the presence of the elders, loose his shoe from off his foot, and spit in his face, and shall answer and say, no, it shall be done unto this man, that thou wilt not build up his brother's house, and his name shall be called in Israel, the house of him that hath his shoe loosened. You know, we look at that and we say, that sure is strange. But that's what God required, right? So that's what happened. So let's look at verse 10 now of Ruth. Moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of Mahon, have I purchased to be my wife, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance, that the name of the dead shall not be cut off among his brethren, and from the gate of his place ye are witnesses to this day. I have a question at this point, and I had a question. Is there a problem with Boaz being an Israelite marrying Ruth, a Moabitess? Wasn't this forbidden as a mixed marriage? Second thing, also, a Moabite was not allowed, and they were forbidden to worship for at least 10 generations. So what do we have here? Deuteronomy 23:3 says, "An Amorite or Moabite shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation shall they not enter into the congregation of the Lord forever." And in Exodus 34:16, among a lot of other verses, it says, "And thou shalt not take of the daughters unto thy sons, and their daughters go a-whoring after their gods, and shall make thy sons go a-whoring after their gods." God's intent there was to keep the Israelites from going after these women, because the result would be exactly what happened. And what happened? They went after these gods and they forsake the God of Israel. So, how can it be said that the marriage of Ruth and Boaz was not prohibited in the Old Testament? We know Boaz wants to do what's right from what we've read so far. Okay, the situation is found and that Ruth and her son would be the 10th generation. So that took care of their problem. Now, there's some that does not agree with that. But whatever. There's got to be a reason. There's got to be a situation where this is okay in God's eyes. The second situation is found in Isaiah chapter 56, verses 1 through 8. And let's turn to that. Turn to Isaiah chapter 56. Isaiah chapter 56, verses 1 through 8. "Thus saith the Lord, keep ye judgments, and do justice, for my salvation is near to come, and my righteousness to be revealed. Blessed is the man that doeth this, and the Son of Man that layeth hold upon it, that keepeth the Sabbath from polluting it, and keepeth his hand from doing any evil. Neither let the son of a stranger that hath joined himself to the Lord speak, saying, The Lord hath utterly separated me from his people. Neither let the eunuch say, Behold, I am a dry tree. For thus saith the Lord unto the eunuchs that keep my Sabbath, and choose the things that please me, and take hold of my covenant, even unto them will I give in my house and within my walls a place, and a name better than the sons and of daughters. I will give them an everlasting name, and shall not be cut off. Also the sons of a stranger that join themselves to the Lord, to serve him, and to love the name of the Lord, to be his servants, every one that keepeth the Sabbath from polluting it, and taketh hold of my covenant, even them will I bring to my holy mountain, and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices shall be accepted upon mine altar, for mine house shall be called a house of prayer for the people. The Lord God, which gathereth the outcasts of Israel, saith, Yet will I gather others to him besides those that are gathered unto him. So again, God is saying, what Ruth did, what did she do? She forsook the other God that she worshiped, and she worshiped the God of Israel. And so she falls in this category. Bob?
Did you notice in Ruth chapter 4 and verse 8 compared to Deuteronomy chapter 25 and verse 8, that things were done, verse 9, things were done a little differently. Because in Ruth's case, the man took off his shoe. Doesn't say anything about getting spit in the face by Ruth. But yet in Deuteronomy chapter 25, it said, "Then shall his brother's wife come unto him in the presence of the elders, loose his shoes from off his foot, spit in his face, and shall answer and say, shall it be done unto that man that will not build up his brother's house?" So there's a little bit of a difference there also because of the circumstances, considering Ruth and Boaz and their relationships and their group that they came out of makes a difference in how that carried out also. And there's a couple of different thoughts about why that may be, but there was a lot of things going on in all of this that sometimes we miss as we're looking at it, because not everything went exactly the way that it was said to be in Deuteronomy.
Yeah, but there is no problem with what went on.
Exactly. God had his plan and it was fulfilled.
Okay, so in looking at this, the problem wasn't who the foreigners were, but what they stood for and what they did. So Israelites would marry their sons and daughters, they would go after idols and turn from God. And what we read here, that's what God said, if they don't do that, then we're okay.
Well, one thing we saw in Boaz, there was 3 qualifications. Obviously, since there was no problem with the other kinsman doing it, he probably didn't fulfill all 3 requirements, where Boaz fulfilled all 3 requirements that were made in order for him to do what he was doing.
So what does that tell us? Anything?
Brother Marvin,
Yes?
I think in Naomi or Ruth, we see that she not only verbally spoke up and said, "I'm going to forsake the gods of my countrymen and worship the gods of Israel," but then we also saw her actions, and even Boaz says she's a virtuous woman, she's obedient, she's loving towards Naomi, kind, respectful. And we also see that she is submitting to Naomi's leadership as the elder of the family. So I think we see both verbal and action. She's following through and doing what she's supposed to do.
Yeah, there's a lot of little nuggets in here, isn't there? All right, let's look at verse 11. And all the people that were in the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses, and the Lord make the woman that is come into thine house like Rachel and like Leah, who did build the house of Israel, and do thou worthily of Ephrath, and be famous in Bethlehem. So may the Lord make Ruth like Rachel and Leah, that the family be increased by her main, and be formed just like Rachel and Leah. They were wives of Jacob, right? And they carried on. So children are a blessing of the Lord. In Psalms, just bring this out, in Psalms 127:3, it says, "Lo, children are a heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of his womb is his reward." And also Psalms 128:3, "The wife shall be as a fruitful vine by the sides of thine house. Thy children are like olive plants round about thy table." All right, let's look at verse 12. says, and let thy house be like the house of Pharez, whom Tabor bore unto Judah, of the seed which the Lord shall give thee of this young woman. If we think about Tamar, it says, and Tamar his daughter-in-law bare him Pharez and Zerah. All the sons of Judah were 5. So what this is bringing out is Boaz was a descendant of the line of Pharez, which was from Judah. And is this important? Yes. We'll look at that at the end of the lesson. In verse 13 of chapter 4, so Boaz took Ruth, and she was his wife, and when he went into her, the Lord gave her conception and bare a son. So God blessed the marriage with a son would be part of the lineage of King David. All right, let's look at verse 14. And the woman said unto Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, which hath not left thee this day without a kinsman, that his name may be famous in Israel. So Boaz had shown himself to be a kinsman redeemer, not only in name, not only in title, but he did something about it. Okay? There was the other legal kinsman that refused, but gladly accepted his responsibility. Boaz said, I'll do it. You know, I thought about the other man was a kinsman redeemer, but he didn't do anything. He was a kinsman redeemer in name. And I thought about, you know, I'm a Christian. Am I a Christian in name only? Or I do what a Christian is supposed to do and live like a Christian is supposed to live. Verse 15, and he shall be unto thee a restorer of thy life, and a nourisher of thine old age, for thy daughter-in-law, which loveth thee, which is better to thee than 7 sons, hath borne him. So we have Naomi going from bitter with no husband, no children, no means of support, by now being cared for. And not only Naomi, but Ruth. The love that Ruth had for Naomi is doing what she did, result in God taking care of them. So Ruth was blessed with a husband and a child and being taken care of. Verse 16, Naomi took the child and laid it in her bosom and became nurse unto it. So, you know, just as grandma today takes your grandchild, you know, holds it and nourishes it, takes care of it, provides for it, loves for it, cares for it, just being a typical grandma. Some say that Naomi adopted the child. I don't believe it. I don't believe that happened. Bob, what do you think? No? Okay. Good. Let's look at verse 17. It says, and the woman, her neighbors, gave it a name, saying, there is a son born to Naomi, and they call his name Obed, for he is the father of Jesse, the father of David. No, they didn't actually give him that name. They, you might say, suggested that name. Obed means a servant, and that's what he was. And here the word father is probably here used as also, but there's other places in the Bible in a general sense, just like the word brother, used in a general sense. Then we have listed in verses 18 through 22 the genealogy, which is brought in to prove that David, by succession, came from the house of Judah. Kinsman redeemer. Just some verses. Boaz was a kinsman redeemer, and he rescued Naomi and Ruth from poverty, providing for them, taking that responsibility. So how does that relate to us? We are sinners and in need of God's redemption, right? And God provided the way through our Redeemer that he provided, which is Jesus Christ. Way back, Job said in verse 25 of chapter 19, "For I know that my Redeemer liveth, and he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth." That's exactly what's going to happen. 1 Corinthians 6:20, "For ye are bought with a price, therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's." Romans 3:24, "Being justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Jesus Christ." Ephesians 1:7, "In whom we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins, according to the riches of his grace." Hebrews 9:12, "Neither by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood he entered in once into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us." So Boaz, kinsman redeemer. Jesus Christ, our Redeemer. Bob?
Boaz was a good example of why Jesus qualified as our Redeemer. And first of all, the requirements Boaz fulfilled were, number one, the relationship had to be right. Number two, he had to be financially able to take on the responsibility. And the number three was willingness to do the work. Jesus came down as a man, the relationship. He had what was necessary in order to fulfill the responsibility. He was God. He had the power. And the third thing was he volunteered. He wasn't required to do it. He volunteered to do the job. Boaz fulfilled the qualifications. Jesus fulfilled the qualifications. That's the picture that we have in the book of Ruth about our redemption coming from our kinsman redeemer.
Thank you, Bob. Appreciate that. Any other comments? Okay, next week we start in the book of Acts. Acts 1 through 14. All right, Brother Frank, would you close in prayer, please?